Welcome to the Jedi Jimmy podcast. My name is James P. White from the Locker Room on 95.7 Cruise FM and the James P. White Experience. Welcome to the Jedi Jimmy podcast. So this is exactly what I'm doing right now. With the Jedi Jimmy podcast, I'm giving you everything nerd, everything Star Wars. So I am dealing with none other than the badass bounty hunter, Boba Fett. The book of Boba Fett, the series on Disney Plus, is actually coming to Disney Plus on December 29th. Now, what I'm doing right now is, because it is a standalone show, I'm giving you the backstory of Boba Fett. So when he was first introduced to the Star Wars universe in the original movies was in The Empire Strikes Back. But what a lot of people don't know, that during the promotions of Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, he was actually part of a lot of the promos and the commercials and the TV spots. But the Boba Fett that we know was a little different back then. He had white armor. Now, in the special edition of Star Wars A New Hope, he actually was part of the group of bounty hunters that was with Jabba the Hutt when he confronted Han Solo on Tatooine, just outside the Millennium Falcon, before they took off on their mission. Now, later he was introduced in Empire Strikes Back. He was one of the many bounty hunters that was brought in by Darth Vader to chase after Han Solo, Leia, Princess Leia Organa, Chewbacca, and the Millennium Falcon. So he ended up chasing them and finding them on Bespin, Cloud City, with Lando Calrissian. And that's when he was trapped and Han Solo was encased in carbonite. Now, shortly thereafter, Vader gave Han Solo to Boba Fett. Then he brought him back to Tatooine, to Jabba the Hutt, where he did have a bounty for him. And then later in Return of the Jedi, when Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, and the whole group escaped the sail barge, Boba Fett was knocked into the Sarlacc pit on Tatooine, where he thought he was gone. But there was a lot more to the origin story of Boba Fett in the prequel series as well as the animated that some people don't know. So actually, Boba Fett was the direct clone, unaltered clone of Jango Fett, who was hired by the at that time it was the Senate, to create a grand clone army for the Republic. So Boba Fett was an unaltered clone, because all the other clones they did speed up process for their growth and made them a little more docile to take better orders, but Boba Fett was unaltered. But during that time as well, there was a second clone that was later introduced in the Bad Batch, was Omega, which was again an unaltered clone of Jango Fett, but ended up being a female. Now, during the Star Wars Episode 2, that's when Boba Fett was on the planet of Geonosis. At the start of the Clone Wars, actually, Boba Fett witnessed the death of his father, Jango Fett, at the hands of Mace Windu, who took his head with his lightsaber. Now, as the show progressed in the sequels, it led into the Clone Wars series, where Boba Fett was growing up. He was in the Clone Academy, learning how to fight, learning how to be a warrior. Then he left the Clone Academy, joined a bunch of bounty hunters and assassins to cause some trouble on Coruscant and throughout the galaxy during the Clone Wars. But he also at several times tried to assassinate Mace Windu, who was the Jedi who killed his father. Now, as time progressed, so he grew up, and then he worked for Boba Fett, and then that led into the original series. Now, where the Book of Boba Fett comes right now is actually 5 years after the end of the Return of the Jedi, where basically miraculously Boba Fett came back from the dead. He was able to crawl out of the Sarlacc pit and was later reunited with his armor by the Din Djarin, who is the Mandalorian, and he got that armor from the Marshal in the first episode of season 2 of The Mandalorian. Now, where the Book of Boba Fett leads up to right now, it starts right after the end of season 2 of The Mandalorian. And so he's been reunited with his armor, but at the end of season 2 of The Mando, they show him going into Jabba's palace, where he kills Bib Fortuna, who was Jabba's right-hand man before he was killed, and now enter the Book of Boba Fett, where now Boba Fett is trying to take over the Hutt's control and become a major gangster. So that's where Boba Fett actually is going to be starting. And so I gave you a little bit of the backstory, but I need to give you a little bit of a time frame with this. So just to give you a little bit, so when I talk about time in the Star Wars universe, there's 2 different time frames. There's BBY, before the Battle of Yavin. That is actually Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. And then ABY is after the Battle of Yavin, which is, again, leading up to the Return of the Jedi and beyond. Now, the Phantom Menace is actually when the clone army was originally hired or created by the Jedi, and also Darth Tyrannus, who is Count Dooku. Now, that is when Boba Fett was cloned, so that's 32 years before the Battle of Yavin. Now, then after that, the start of the Clone Wars was actually 22 years before the Battle of Yavin. And 3 years before the Battle of Yavin is actually when Jabba the Hutt captures... 3 years after the Battle of Yavin is when Empire Strikes Back takes place. 4 years after the Battle of Yavin is when Boba Fett is knocked into the Sarlacc pit. 9 years after the Battle of Yavin is when Din Djarin meets the Mandalorian, meets Boba Fett, and then it was around that time that is about where the Book of Boba Fett actually starts. Now, for timeline's sake, with the 9 years after the Battle of Yavin, just so you know, Star Wars Force Awakens actually took place 34 years after the Battle of Yavin. So, just so you know for time. Now, one thing I'm going to do during every one of these podcasts is I'm also going to give some of my predictions and my ideas and my interpretation of stuff that's happened so far. Now, watching the trailers and the TV spots, I caught a few things that I think is going to show up soon. So basically, as I said, Boba Fett is going to become a gangster. And in these TV spots, they showed a few different new characters. One of which is a Twi'lek, which is basically a humanoid creature that has these almost like antennas, but they're big skin appendages that come out of the top of their head. It looks almost like a hairpiece, but it's actually part of their body. And Jennifer Beals actually is going to be playing one of these characters. And you may know her from like Flashdance and stuff like that. So that's one thing that they've noticed. But if you really look, because you never really, during the time of Jabba the Hutt, never really got to see his throne up close and personal. Now, his throne is shown in the book of Boba Fett in one of these trailers, and you see some fancy writing on the back. It's written around the outside of the circle. Now, that writing is really, really cool because it's actually a form of Sith writing. So it's actually a throne of one of the Sith, but it's plays and looks very close and familiar to some writing that was found in the Rebels animated series in a Jedi temple as well. So there's going to be a little bit of a link, I think, between this and the Sith and the Jedi, which might move a little bit forward into the future to the Ahsoka Tano series that's going to be coming out in the next year or so. Ahsoka Tano was a Jedi that was also introduced to people that haven't seen the animated series during the Mandalorian as well. Now, with the first book episode of the Mandalorian coming up December 29th, I'm really quite excited about it because during these trailers, they've showed a few other little tidbits and stuff that links to Ahsoka, that leads to the Rebels, and one of which is Ahsoka Tano and the Jedi during the early part of the rebellion worked with a girl by the name of Hera. Okay, worked with a Twi'lek woman. So again, with the same top, it was Hera Syndulla. But during this trailer, they show a glimpse of a man of the same race that looks exactly like her father, Cham Syndulla. So I am so excited to see this because I think there's going to be a link to going into the upcoming series, Ahsoka and the Jedi, Ezra Bridger, and several others that I'm so excited for. So my next episode for my podcast, the Jedi Jimmy podcast, will be actually the Thursday after the release of the book of Boba Fett. So that will be around December 29th. And then every Thursday after the episodes will be the Jedi Jimmy podcast. Just a warning, going forward, there might be some spoilers, and again, my opinion on every episode. Thank you so much for joining my first episode for the Jedi Jimmy podcast. I am so excited to be here. This is going to be so much fun, and I look forward to seeing you next week.